Hello and welcome to the interview series organized by South Asia Research Institute for Minorities, SARIM. I'm your host, Furqan Ahmed. Today, we are really honored to have with us Ms. Sudeshna Thapa, all the way from Nepal. Thank you so much, Ms. Thapa, for being on board.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ahmed, for having me. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, she is an advocate for advancing minority rights through international human rights law. Sudeshna has worked on a range of issues related to minority rights, including the intersectionality of minority rights and the challenges faced by minority groups. In this conversation, we will explore Sudeshna's work, her insight and experiences in the field of minority rights. So, without further ado, I will start off with our first question. What inspired you to become an advocate for advancing minority rights through international human rights law? And what are some of the major challenges you have faced in this field?
Thank you, Mr. Ahmed. Before I answer that, allow me to say a couple of words about what I do here in Nepal. Like you said, I'm a lawyer by training. I have a specialization in international human rights law, and I'm currently working as a researcher at an organization called Social Science Baha. Social Science Baha is a research institute that is based in Kathmandu, and we're engaged in research on a range of different issues that relate specifically to minority rights and inclusion, but also more general issues like labor and migration and environment and other things. We're part of this regional network called the South Asia Collective. So the South Asia Collective is it's a network of human rights activists and organizations across the South Asia region that have come together specifically for the cause of documenting the condition of minorities in the region and helping ensure that we can work towards better human rights outcomes for minorities. So let me also tell you a little about our flagship initiative as part of the South Asia Collective, which is the production of this annual report, which is called the South Asia State of Minorities Report. So we produce this report every year, and every year the report focuses on a different theme. And very apt for our conversation today, the theme for this year was focused on international human rights. And as part of that report, we've focused on how each of the states in the region have performed vis-a-vis their human rights commitments, and also how we have made an attempt to assess how they deliver across civil and political rights, but also social and economic rights. So having said that, growing up in Nepal, I'm sure as a lot of other people in the region can also relate, I have always been witness to the kind of social and economic disadvantage that individuals belonging to minority groups always face. And I've also realized increasingly in my work that across the board, it's always minorities that are at a disproportionate disadvantage. And it's always minorities that are most vulnerable to human rights abuses and exploitation by both state actors, but also by non-state actors. And it's always minorities who are faced with barriers in exercising their human rights, be it civil political rights or socioeconomic rights. And so I think it's important to shed light on the increasing infringement of the rights of minority groups and do whatever we can to hold governments accountable, but also to inform and sensitize individuals and communities about the importance of minority rights. Thanks.
Thank you so much for briefly explaining about, first of all, your work and kind of initiative that your flagship program is taking, and you've also highlighted the kind of issue that minority face in Nepal. So I would like to thank you on that. So moving on to our next question. Uh, in your opinion, what are some of the key international human rights instruments that have most effective that have been most effective in protecting the rights of minorities, and what role do they play in shaping the legal framework?
I think all of the 9 core treaties are relevant when it comes to minority rights. The 9 core international human rights treaties, I mean, and we know that UN treaties, they form the basis of the international human rights law regime, and that states are under the obligation to ensure that everyone in the country enjoys the rights set out in the treaties once they've ratified these treaties. Um, in addition to the core international human rights treaties, also important are the international treaties under the international humanitarian law regime, and also instruments like the ILO Convention on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples, for example, that focus on particular minority groups like Indigenous people. But having said all of that, I think it's also very important to say that there remain various challenges in the South Asia region with regard to the application of these treaties and the human rights standards that are enshrined in these treaties. First is the fact that many of these important treaties have not been ratified by all the countries in the region. And even when they have been ratified, many countries have ratified the treaties with reservations and declarations that reduce the effect these treaties can have. Um, just for example, the Convention on the Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers and their Families, for instance, and the Convention on Enforced Disappearance. These 2 conventions have like the least number of ratifications from South Asian countries out of all the 9 core human rights treaties. Also, if you look at the ILO Convention on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples, Nepal is the only country in the South Asian region to have ratified the treaty. Also, when we talk about these international conventions and treaties, I think it's important to point out that with regard to the core international human rights treaties, many of the optional protocols and individual complaints, inquiry, and interstate communication procedures, these have not been ratified by many countries in the South Asian region, and that, in effect, renders the treaties toothless because of that. I think it's also important to point out that many countries in our region have not been complying effectively with reporting obligations that arise from ratification of these treaties. And they've also not been engaging effectively with other mechanisms, such as reporting under the UPR, for instance, or reporting under other special procedures, mandate holders, for instance. So all of that also has to be taken into account when we talk about ratification of treaties under the international human rights law regime. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I must agree with you that there is non-compliance when it comes to, uh, you know, reporting into the UPR. You've also highlighted the challenges into the applications that South Asian countries faced. Most of the treaties are not been ratified. That is correctly highlighted as well. And I've really great to know that Nepal is the only country which ratified the ILO treaty, right? So thank you so much for enlightening us on this very important issue. So moving forward, could you please speak to the intersectionality of human rights and how international human rights law can be used to address discrimination and marginalization faced by minority groups on the basis of factors such as race, gender, sexuality, and disability?
Sure. I mean, I think I should start out by saying that as human rights defenders, we're like always faced with challenges when we talk about advancing the agenda of minority rights. I mean, first and foremost, we're faced with challenges when it comes to proper documentation of the situation of minorities. Then we're faced with challenges with regard to disseminating the information we have and spreading awareness. And of course, then we're also faced with challenges when advocating for like better outcomes for minorities overall. Um, I mean, in the South Asian region these days, there's also been increasing instances where human rights defenders have reported increased surveillance and scrutiny, and we've also like seen an increase in like increased lashback against human rights defenders, and a shrinking civic space overall for activists, journalists, and human rights defenders. But having said that, I think it's still important to hold states accountable and to sensitize the wider community and policymakers about the importance of minority rights. Um, Also, I think implementation here is the key factor in terms of protection of minority rights. Um, of course, it's important to ensure that the domestic legal framework of countries align with the international human rights standards, but I think that alone is of no use if the implementation part is weak. Nepal, for instance, has ratified 7 of the 9 core international human rights treaties, and is widely acknowledged across the region as a country with a domestic legal regime that is very favorable to the protection of minority rights. And Nepal continues to like demonstrate commitment to uphold human rights norms and principles in general, but also the rights of minorities in particular. Um, our constitution, the constitution of 2015, Nepal's the constitution that's currently in force, it enshrines a number of fundamental rights for minorities, including things like right to religion, language, and culture. And it also has separate provisions that are dedicated specifically to protecting the rights of particular minority groups, such as like Dalits or indigenous people and other marginalized communities. The constitution itself is also supplemented by various other provisions that are scattered across legislations like the civil and criminal code of the country, legislations like the Caste-Based Discrimination and Untouchability Act, and various others. We also have like affirmative measures for minorities in particular. Our constitution, it promises to improve the representation of minorities in the state structure. But it's important to point out that in practice, minorities continue to be excluded, and the state has failed to uplift their living standards. There's like a wide gap in terms of law and implementation, and communities such as Dalits, indigenous groups, and other minority groups, they continue to face significant disparities. So yeah, I think implementation is key. So that's what I'd like to highlight again. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for enlightening us regarding some of the key challenges that, I mean, us as human rights defenders face, such as, backlash against human rights defenders. You've also talked about the implementations of, again, in the South Asian region, which is very difficult. We do have those treaties, but implementation, when it comes to implementation, it becomes very challenging. You also highlighted that there is also practical challenges when it comes to, implementing those rights. So thank you so much for your insight. So moving forward to another, it's a populist moment question. So, given the rise of the populist and national governments in many parts of the world, what challenges do you see for the advancement of minority rights through international human rights law, and how can these challenges be addressed?
So in terms of challenges, I think like I said earlier, first there's the issue that the international human rights standards, norms, and principles, they have not been transposed adequately into the domestic legal framework of countries. And then there's the challenge that even when protection has been provided in principle in the legal framework, and there are certain measures that exist for the protection of minority groups, these have not been implemented effectively. So also, like I pointed out earlier, there are things like reservations. There's reluctance to accede to optional protocols of key treaties. There's reluctance to accept individual complaints procedures, for example. Um, and there's a constant failure to comply with reporting obligations. I mean, if you see across the region, there's like a massive backlog in reporting to treaty bodies, for example, for all the countries in the South Asian region. So all of this, it evidences weak commitment on the part of states to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights of minorities and of the citizens of these countries in general. And we can also see in the past decade that there's been an increase in intolerance towards minorities, particularly religious minorities in many of the countries in the region. For example, Nepal has seen an attempt to institutionalize prohibition on proselytization. Pakistan, for instance, has passed some of the harshest blasphemy laws in the region. So I think amidst all of these challenges, addressing these require like collective and concerted efforts from a range of different actors, including national governments, the wider international community, and also local and regional civil society organizations like the South Asia Collective and the South Asia Research Institute for Minorities that have been working relentlessly to advocate for the rights of minority groups.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. First of all, on the issue of reluctancy and in complying to the to reporting to the international treaty bodies, and it also like you pointed out that it has evidence weak commitments, and you also highlighted some of the provisions that are taking place in Nepal and in Pakistan regarding those against minority groups. So yeah, moving back to our next question. I mean, how do you envision the future of minority rights advocacy, and what role can civil society organizations and international institutions play in advancing this agenda?
I think civil society organizations can play a key role in advancing the agenda of minority rights, in that they are key actors when it comes to spurring debate about minority rights and issues surrounding pluralism, inclusion, and democracy and accountability in general. And that, in effect, it helps create the conditions for states and regional and international mechanisms to give serious consideration to the issues that are affecting minority groups. And having said that, also hand in hand, I think civil society organizations, they shoulder the responsibility of engaging in honest and impactful reporting and documentation of the situation of minorities in these countries.
Yeah, thank you so much for emphasizing on the role of civil society and how important, I mean, their steps can be for the benefits of minority groups. So, in your experience, what are some of the most effective strategies for promoting awareness and understanding of minority rights among policymakers, the media, and the wider public?
In that regard, I think it's important for all actors at the national level, at the regional level, and at the international level to invest in greater capacity for effective documentation and reporting of the human rights performance of states, whilst advocating for improvements at the same time. I also think it's equally important to promote solidarity across borders so that we can then aggregate demands regionally and create meaningful spaces for learning and sharing. Um, in terms of strategies, I think it's also important to reference international human rights standards, for example, when we report on the violations of human rights of minority groups. And it's important to continue to create pressure on the governments, but also hand in hand sensitize communities and individuals about the importance of pluralism, acceptance, and uh, spread awareness regarding anti-majoritarian values, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. First of all, I mean, cross-border or cross-provincial or cross-country, cross-regional harmony is the key in pressurizing the international human rights bodies, and also promote solidarities against, I mean, across borders on this key important issue. So, I mean, this is something that is related to its economic, outcome of those minority groups. So, to what extent do the economic interest and power dynamics of hegemonic countries impact the implementation of international human rights law framework, particularly in relation to the countries with weaker economic and political standing, countries like us?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important question, and I think the overall assessment of the human rights situation in countries and deliberations on the human rights situation, it tends to be driven by national interest for most countries, and that's not just true of countries in the global north, but also true of how South Asian states tend to respond to the human rights situation in other countries within the region also, actually. um, for instance, to give you examples, states will, often abstain from voting on resolutions, for instance, that hold their allies accountable, and they'll refrain from acknowledging failure to protect the human rights of the citizens of their ally countries and minorities in particular. And that, in effect, it impacts the measures then taken by the states to ensure human rights outcomes for their citizens. Uh, so yeah, I think all of that has a ripple effect, and the whole course that deliberations on human rights situations of countries takes, it ultimately impacts the actual situation of minorities in individual countries.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to implementation, you said it right, and you've connected that dot correctly right now. That national, driven interest always come into play when it comes to implementing those human rights provisions, and that's why they often fail, in reaching out those targets.
Hmm.
Our final question would be that could you speak to the role of South Asia in global discourse of minority rights, and how the work of organizations such as SARIM can contribute, or or your organization, which is Collective, right? What was its name? I'm
Right,
sorry.
the South Asia Collective.
Yeah, South Asia Collective
Yeah.
can contribute to advancing this agenda at the regional and international levels.
Yeah, thank you for that question. South Asia is indeed home to like about a fifth of humankind. So the region definitely has a key role in advancing the global discourse on minority rights. Like I also said earlier, organizations like SARIM, organizations like the South Asia Collective, and other civil society organizations in the region, they play a key role in sounding the alarm, so to say, and in raising concerns about human rights abuses, especially for minority groups, because in our region we know that minority groups are often voiceless, and um, instances of abuse against minorities often go unreported, and they're faced with multiple barriers when trying to speak out about the abuse and exploitation they face. So I think organizations like us, they must continue to demand and encourage states to ratify key international human rights instruments, but also not just have the instruments ratified, but then also comply with the obligations that arise out of these ratifications, and act on recommendations that are received from the international community, from the UN mechanisms. And I think one major thing I must say is that at the regional level, a lacuna at present is that there's an absence of a regional process and mechanism, like what's present in other countries, in other regions like Europe or Africa. So there's a lack of a regional mechanism that that can facilitate better human rights outcomes for minorities, and I think organizations like SARIM and South Asia Collective can also help realize this goal of creating such a regional mechanism that is robust and that can facilitate and deliver better human rights outcomes. And like I said earlier, we have this responsibility of engaging in effective reporting and documentation of the human rights situation of minorities, of reporting on how states are performing, and of creating this collective pressure at the regional and at the international level on individual governments to act on their obligations and implement these obligations effectively. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you so much for providing such an insightful conversation on advancing minority rights through international human rights law. We discussed the challenges faced by the minority groups and the importance of international human rights instruments and in protecting their rights. You've also shared effective strategies for promoting awareness of minority rights among policymakers, the media, and the public. We've also explored the impact of economic interest and power, dynamics of hegemonic countries on the implementation of international human rights law. Finally, you've also discussed the role of South Asian global discourse on human rights, and how organizations such as South Asia Collective and SARIM can contribute to advancing this agenda. Your work and experience provided us light on the challenges faced by the minority groups and the importance of advocating for the protection of advancement of minority rights around the world. So we are truly intrigued and we are really honored to have you for today's discourse. Thank you so much for providing us your valuable time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ahmed.
Thank you so much.
It's been great. Thank you for the opportunity to share the work we're doing, and hoping to work together towards this agenda of advancing minority rights.
Yeah, thank you so much. And probably we could do something on a collaborative stage, maybe arranging some policy papers or maybe some collective webinar on issues like these to to spread the message,
Yeah.
what is required. So thank you so much on behalf of
Yes.
SARA.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.